All right, Joel, we can perhaps get started and I'll just keep letting people in as they join us.
Good afternoon from Washington, D.C., where it is 12:05 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on this historic day. Juneteenth is a federal holiday. I am Joel Fishman, President of the Public Diplomacy Association of America. Welcome to our June mid-month forum. We look forward to in-person programs again when we can greet each other in person and catch up on the past year and a half. If all indications continue as they are now, we hope to bring you such an in-person program in early fall at Decor Bacon House when we can again enjoy lunch together with our guests. Fortunately, thanks to the partnership between PDAA, the Public Diplomacy Council, and the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, we have been able to reach out to you through video conferencing, and today welcome you to this program with Turkish journalist and Al Monitor Senior Correspondent Amberin Zaman. Our moderator today is Ambassador Greta Mars. Greta serves as co-chair of the joint PDAA-PDC Program Committee. Please note that today's program is a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar. So I am turning the mic over to Katie Conte, today's tech host, to explain the details.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. So excited that you could join us today for what is sure to be a wonderful conversation. So today in our meeting, if you have any questions following our moderator and distinguished speakers dialogue, you're more than welcome to ask your questions in one of two ways. You can either click on the bottom of your screen, there is a chat box, and you may type your question in there. Or you can go, if you're looking on a computer, you can go to where it says reactions, also on the bottom of your screen, and you can click on raise hand. And if you would like to raise hand, then you're more than welcome to raise hand, and we'll allow you to ask your question audibly and with video. So again, you can either put it into the chat box, or you can go to reactions and raise hand. And for those who might be joining us on the phone, you are more than welcome to, at some point, just unmute yourself and we will try to get your question answered as well. So thank you very much. And I'll turn this back over to Ambassador Morris.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you, Joel. Welcome, everyone, and a special welcome to Amberin Zaman, who is a senior correspondent with the Al Monitor online news organization. Amberin was born in New York City to a Turkish mother and a Bangladeshi father. After she studied in Switzerland, she served as the Turkish correspondent with the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post and the Economist, among other publications. She continues to contribute to other newspapers around the world, in addition to her work with Al Monitor, which is based here in Washington, D.C. So we're going to begin with a dialogue between Amberin and myself. And then, as Katie explained, there will be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions if you wish. So Amberin, could you begin by describing the current situation in Turkey, and particularly with regard to President Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism and crackdown on human rights and freedom of the press? What do you believe is driving this, and what, if anything, can the US and other democratic countries do to try to improve the situation?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me today. It's a great honor. And I just wanted to say that I only work for Al Monitor. I'm a staff correspondent there. The question is, of course, a very broad one, but in a nutshell, if you were to ask me to describe the situation in Turkey today, I'd say it's pretty awful on several fronts. But as you mentioned, of course, this increasing authoritarianism, the fact that rule of law has collapsed in Turkey, and that rather than a government, we currently have a regime in place as President Erdogan systematically dismantles all of the institutions that make for a democracy. But before I focus on the present, I think it's worth reminding our audience that Turkey was always flawed, was never a full democracy, and that this government came to power nearly 20 years ago, promising to make it one. And that the necessary condition for that was to dismantle military tutelage, which existed all this time. So while you did have democratically elected governments and relatively free and fair elections, we all knew that from behind the scenes on key policy issues, national security, foreign policy, it was the army that called the shots. So when Erdogan came to power, everybody was very hopeful, and he did some great things. He reached out to the Kurds, he eased bans on Kurdish language education, he reached out to he decriminalized talking about the Armenian genocide. He did various things, and notably, of course, went out of his way to trim the power of the military. And so you have the European Union, however reluctantly, begin full membership negotiations with Turkey in 2005. But then, how did things go so badly wrong? And I would say that, again, first of all, we were perhaps misled by Erdogan and didn't realize that for him, all of these things, and most of all, trimming the power of the military, who was his greatest enemy, because for the army, of course, political Islam was always presented alongside ethnic separatism, Kurdish separatism, as the main evil threat to Turkey. And so for him, trimming their power was key. But once he got there, and he did this in concert with this religious sect known as the Gülenists, and their leader, a Sunni imam, actually lives in Pennsylvania. He and his group, his network, and it's a very powerful one, worked in concert by mobilizing public opinion, the media, convincing the Europeans, perhaps even the Americans, that this was all for the greater good, but resorted to methods that now we see being still perpetuated, ones of outright fabricating evidence against people in the military and going through these sham trials. And while many of the claims about the army were actually valid, and they've done some pretty awful things, a lot of them weren't. And then I'll fast forward, I don't want to take up too much of your time. These two groups, Erdogan and the Gülen group, fell out. And while the Gülenists would like to present this as as it being about ideology and ethics, they took issue with Erdogan's tilt towards Iran, his anti-Semitism, his corruption, etc. In fact, it was really mostly about the spoils of power and the fact that they couldn't agree on who should get how much of what. And so we got to the point where there was open war between them, and the Gülenists, who had already inserted themselves inside the security establishment, mounted this huge corruption case against Erdogan and tried to overthrow him by exposing his corruption, but failed, and many of those prosecutors, policemen, ended up in jail. So apparently they carried things, they escalated and were involved in this coup attempt to overthrow Erdogan in 2016, which failed. And since then, things have really gone south. The fact of this failed coup gave Erdogan cover to declare a state of emergency and to jail tens of thousands of his opponents, to crack down on civil liberties. But already, even before we got to that point, and since, the media is a big focus of our discussion today, he had been gradually asserting control over the media. And how did he do that? He got his businessmen cronies to buy up or buy out or many of the mainstream existing news channels and newspapers. And in exchange, these people got very lucrative government contracts. And so through his control of the media, he was able to control the narrative. And of course, one that demonizes the opposition, and most particularly the Kurdish opposition. And at the same time, to cover up his corruption and to create this myth of a Turkey that, is being restored to its erstwhile glory during Ottoman times, one that, is sort of reclaiming its place as a regional player. And of course, underpinning this with its regional adventures in Syria, Libya, and northern Iraq and the Eastern Mediterranean. But, how does Turkey look today? It just looks very bad. We don't know for certain that, we can even have a proper election. They're already hardly free or hardly fair because, as I said, Erdogan controls the media. He also controls the judiciary. It's highly politicized. And many of his serious opponents are in jail, including the former leader of the main Kurdish party, who was a very effective opposition figure. And so we're now, and of course, we need to mention the fact that there was this shift from the parliamentary system to the executive presidency, which concentrates power in Erdogan's hands. And we've already had, an election where he was re-elected under, we had quite clear evidence of ballot rigging and that sort of thing, which presumably can only get worse as his poll ratings suffer because the economy is doing very poorly. So we're not sure what the next election, which is due in 2023, will look like. How much cheating will be required? Can he do that? Get away with it, win that election while still maintaining some shred of, legitimacy, some veneer of legitimacy? We don't know. And that's one of the big questions that looms ahead.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Amberin, for the really, really helpful historical background to how we've gotten to where we are. Well, as all of you know, Turkey and the United States, of course, are allies and both members of NATO, and that relationship was highlighted this past week when when Presidents Biden and Erdogan held a private summit meeting on the margins of the NATO summit. So I'm wondering if you could just describe briefly how you see the current state of U.S. Turkey relations, and whether or not this private meeting contributed in any way to improving those relations. And then also, if you could just talk about what the United States might do to help improve the relationship with Turkey while not sacrificing our very important human rights goals. And also, since we have a lot of public diplomacy professionals on this call, how do you see public diplomacy, information, and particularly exchange programs as playing a role in better relations between Turkey and the United States?
Well, I would start by saying that this meeting between the two presidents, that one that Turkey had been desperately hoping would happen sooner, and President Biden did not pick up the phone and call Erdogan all this time. I would say that what it achieved was to I guess slap a band-aid on things. I mean, because things have the potential to get even worse. And, we don't really know what was said, because that meeting was held privately with no note takers, but just translators initially. And only after, I think, half an hour or so did the two delegations get together and talk about the very real problems that exist between the United States and Turkey. And you say, what does the United States need to do to improve this relationship? I would say that the onus really is on Turkey now to improve the relationship, because I think that's certainly what this administration has made very clear, that they're ready and willing. Turkey is an extremely important country, of course. It's a member of NATO, a very large and influential country with which the United States has traditionally enjoyed robust, if difficult, relations. And of course, the most immediate problem before us is this matter of the S-400s, the fact that Turkey acquired the S-400s. And we don't really know why Erdogan decided to proceed with that sale, given that the United States, I think, made it extremely clear what the likely consequences were. And perhaps it was that he didn't take that so seriously, because we had a rather unique kind of administration running this country for a long while, for 4 years, and a president with whom Erdogan had this very good chemistry. He was able to pick up the phone pretty much whenever he wanted and get directly through to President Trump. And perhaps he imagined that, that this situation could continue and that President Trump might be reelected. And that didn't happen. And in the meantime, the Congress did slap sanctions on Turkey, and Turkey did get ejected out of the F-35 program, which is terribly important for a country like Turkey, and presumably won't be allowed back in for the foreseeable future. So how do they get around this deadlock? Because it's written into law now that Turkey has to give up possession of the S-400s, and Turkey is unable to, or says it's unable to do that it's a done deal. Mm-hmm. So, when I say that further damage was prevented, apparently Turkey has made the decision, though I don't have real confirmation of that, this is just rumor, has decided to not take possession of a second set of these batteries, which I think it did pay for. So what a terrible deal, because it's not even able to activate these missiles. So we have that big challenge ahead of us, because for as long as Turkey has that stuff, whether it's mothballed or not, the law is very clear. The sanctions won't be lifted. So there's that. And then there's the whole business of Syria, of northeast Syria, another big problem between the two countries, because the United States is currently partnered with a Syrian Kurdish-led militia, which helped the US-led coalition defeat the Islamic State territorially in Syria. And that group also happens to be very closely linked to a Kurdish militia that's been fighting Turkey since 1984, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a group that is labeled terrorist not just by Turkey, but the European Union and the United States as well. And we all know that, the claim by the United States that these two groups are distinct is fiction. But maintaining that fiction has allowed the United States to perpetuate this partnership. And of course, there are very good reasons why the United States did partner with them because Turkey for the longest time failed to come up with an alternative. But, setting aside the reasons why the US, was propelled into this relationship that happens to have been an extremely successful one in military terms, viewed from Ankara, it's treasonous, because these people, the people who are now leading northeast Syria, these Kurds, were all fighting Turkey at one point in their career. They have been members of the PKK, and that includes, some of the very senior figures that the US engages with in Syria. So, Turkey very much wants the United States to abandon that partnership, but the United States refuses to do so on the grounds that the job isn't finished. But while the caliphate has been annihilated territorially, ISIS still does present a threat. So that's another big challenge in the relationship. And then, of course, there's the whole question of this Sunni cleric who I mentioned in my earlier remarks, who has residence in the United States in Pennsylvania, who Turkey says was involved in the coup, but apparently the proof that Turkey has presented hasn't been convincing enough that the United States would extradite him. So that's another, big point of contention between the two countries. And then there's this ongoing case against the Turkish state lender Halkbank, which, the United States says and has proven to have been at the center of sanction busting activities, with Iran, helping Iran launder its money and bust sanctions through this oil for gold trade. And the state lender was apparently very much part of that whole scheme, and is facing a very stiff fine from the US Treasury. And Turkey's position to date has been that no, it wasn't, that they were innocent and this is all untrue, and has failed to convince the United States of that, the courts of that. And so how that is resolved is another big question, because it has very clear implications if the bank gets fined for the Turkish economy, which is not doing terribly well. So we have all these issues outstanding before us. And, as far as human rights are concerned, of course, this government, this new administration says it cares very much about human rights. And we very much hope, at least in Turkey, people hope that it does. And I would say that the opposition in Turkey, civil society, people who are trying desperately to push back against this authoritarianism, were quite disappointed that the meeting between the two presidents took place at all, given that Turkey has not, taken any steps. For instance, if indeed this government is so keen to fix relations with the United States as it says it does, why are employees of the US consulate in Istanbul still in jail and under house arrest? There are two people who worked with the Drug Enforcement Administration who since 2017 have been in jail. One is under house arrest, but still, that's confinement. And the government is doing nothing. And we all know that if Erdogan chose to, he could, because he controls the judiciary. So, one wonders why, without having yielded anything, why is it that he gets FaceTime with the president? And people would then respond, well, it's because the US wants Turkey to help them out in Afghanistan, where there are now talks underway for Turkish forces to protect Kabul airport and, make life easier for the US as it withdraws, for NATO as it withdraws. And as some Turks would see things, Turkey will be putting their boys in harm's way just to help the US out, and, nothing advancing in terms of human rights and democracy in Turkey, with loads of journalists still behind bar. And indeed, still employees of the US consulate still confined. So, a bit of disappointment there, shall I say.
Mhm. And the question on public diplomacy, do you want to comment on that, please?
Well, yes, of course, I think public diplomacy is extremely important. And I think that exchange, I mean, in terms of, engaging the Turkish public, we all, say that Turkey isn't Erdogan and that one day, he won't be in power any longer. And in the meantime, you do have a very robust civil society that, paradoxically grew and flourished under Erdogan in his early reformist days. And, especially the fact that Turkey had opened membership talks with the European Union allowed the European Union to fund a lot of civil society programs. And I think it's very important that the United States too sustain that kind of engagement with civil society, with the media, exchange programs, IV programs, NATO partnership programs, also keeping members of the Turkish military engaged and having them trained, in California. I think there's that academy and other places. I think all of that is terribly important, of course. And I think the public messaging is also very important. I think it is terribly critical, given, how important social media has become, that, on issues of press freedom, human rights, minority rights, gay rights, that the US be much more vocal. I think it's incredibly important that that kind of pressure be sustained, and that sends a very, positive message to all of those people in Turkey who are really fighting very hard. And I think it's very important, especially to help fund independent media, as the European Union has been doing. I think the US does do some of that, but I think it should do much more of that, because what we've seen is that increasingly independent digital media has become a very increasingly important source of news for people, that an increasing number of people are shifting to independent digital news for their information. So it was a recent study done by the IPI, the International Press Institute, showed that while some 44% of people go to government-controlled outlets, now you have more than 33% who now consume independent news outlet information, and that while the numbers for the government outlets is stagnating and indeed going down, the number of people migrating to independent news is going up. But sadly, platforms like Google, Facebook, their AI programming keeps directing people to the government-controlled outlets. And that's something I think that the US government, that regulators should be looking at much more closely, and bringing pressure to bear on those platforms to not do that, because we all know why they are, because they're seeking to protect their commercial interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very, very helpful. You've answered some of this already, but just looking at some of the other countries in the region, and particularly Syria and Iraq, how has the repression in Turkey then spilled over into these other neighboring countries, and specifically Syria and Iraq? And as I said, you've talked a little bit about this, but if you have more to add on that, that would be great.
Well, it's spilled over very dramatically. If we look at Syria today, the Turkish army occupies large swathes of northern and northeastern Syria, and where initially Turkey's intervention was aimed at overthrowing the Assad regime, but then when the Russians came in 2015 in a very forceful way and rescued Assad basically through their intervention, of course the Turks had to review their plans And, the United States had long since, given up any idea of regime change anyway. And so they found themselves very isolated. And so their main focus became to prevent the Kurds of Syria from gaining any kind of rights, gaining any kind of ground, any kind of political autonomy of a kind that would serve as a magnet, as Turkey saw things, for their own Kurds. And it was all the more threatening to Turkey, particularly since the group that was in charge in northeastern Syria, and since 2014 has had this backing of the US military, that they would be, part of this broader movement, Kurdish armed movement that's fighting Turkey. So they decided to shift their focus to undermining them in every way that they could. And so you first in 2018 had this invasion of a Kurdish majority enclave called Afrin in northern Syria. And Turkey, when it goes in, of course, goes in with its Sunni rebel proxies, the very same proxies that it was training, arming in the hope of overthrowing Assad. And many of these groups have been involved in all kinds of war crimes, rape, murder, extortion rackets. So when they move in and they capture these areas, it's hugely destabilizing. You've had huge shifts in the population. So this particular enclave that I mentioned, Afrin, for instance, Kurdish majority, a lot of displacement and a lot of repression. And we saw the same thing repeated in October 2019, when President Trump greenlighted another Turkish offensive that pushed the US's Kurdish partners out of another big swathe of territory in northeast Syria. And again, you had 500,000 people displaced, again, these same sort of gangs, the Kurds call them, these militias coming in and committing horrific abuses, summary executions. And this has been documented by the United Nations. And Turkey coming in and illegally rendering hundreds of people on the claim that these people are members of the PKK. So let's say that you are a Kurd who worked for the local administration there. You were a policeman, but just directing traffic at a roundabout. For the Turks, that constituted membership of a terrorist organization. And they are still illegally rendering these people to Turkey and then putting them in jail in Turkey. There are hundreds like this, and then prosecuting them and sentencing them to, very long sentences in prison. And this is a violation of international humanitarian law. And this is going on, and you don't really hear very much said about it, these kinds of practices. And so that's what's happening inside Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan. You have an ongoing and unremitting Turkish military operation against the PKK there, which is causing tremendous upheaval, a lot of, again, displacement of civilians and people having to abandon their homes and villages destroyed. And at the same time, more recently, as the Turks try and reduce the sort of space where these guerrillas can take shelter, they've begun to just cut down entire forests. So they have nowhere to hide. And so the local population is also seeing, deforestation, losing, their forests. It's all, Turkey acting with huge impunity. And there was a very sort of dramatic incident that took place in March, I believe it was, when Turkey bombed this area in northeast Syria, northern Iraq, where several Turkish military people were being held hostage by the PKK, and they all perished in this Turkish bombing attack. So it's not only Kurds dying, but Turks as well. And of course, it's hugely destabilizing for the Kurdistan regional government there. Yet, because they're so dependent on Turkey, because their oil flows through Turkey, is exported through Turkey, there's very little they can do to push back. And sadly, there's very little said by the United States about that too.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Amberin. I still have another question I could ask, but I want to see if we have any questions from the audience. Anyone who would like to raise an issue. You've given us such a very, really very complete description that I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm not seeing any raised hands yet.
So as a reminder, if you'd like to raise your hand to ask a question on video or with audio, you can go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click raise hand. Otherwise, Greta, I do see that we have a couple of questions in the chat box.
Okay, wonderful.
Sure. So would you like to start with, perhaps we have one that's from Michael Anderson for Amberin. What is your assessment of how foreign journalists are treated in the US? Do they have any problems of concerns working in the US? And is the new Biden administration doing enough to welcome foreign journalists, say through visa policy or state's foreign press center?
Well, I honestly don't know the answer to that question, certainly not the technical side of things, but you know, as far as I'm aware, foreign journalists don't have a problem here. Not that I'm aware of. Of course, I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert on that subject, so I'm afraid, you know, if there were problems, I wouldn't necessarily know. But I'm not aware of any.
Okay, and there's another, you said there was another question in the chat box, Katie?
Yes, we also have one from Joan Moore. That's how can Voice of America and US international broadcasting be more effective in Turkey?
Well, I used to work for the Voice of America, so I think that first of all they could be doing a lot more, many more stories than they currently are, and they should be expanding their presence because I follow their work very closely, and when I compare it to, say, the German equivalent of the Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, they're so much more prolific because they're investing so much more in it. And at the same time, they're doing a lot more TV, and you know, they've really built up their staff there. And interestingly, whereas in the past, typically Turkish people, you know, would rarely seek out news from foreign outlets, even if they're publishing, broadcasting in the Turkish language. Increasingly, because of the repression, because the media is so under such assault from the government, they are turning to foreign outlets like BBC Turkish, Deutsche Welle Turkish, and the Arabs too are investing. You have Sharq al-Awsat, which is the Saudi newspaper that's published now in the Turkish language. Al Monitor, who I work for, publishes in Turkish. I think that the Voice of America could clearly be doing more. That's what I would say.
Okay, very, very interesting. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, well, I had one other question, and that is, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how both the Turkish media and the Turkish people view the United States. Positively, negatively, what are some of their, do they wish the US would speak out more about the repression and human rights issues in their country? How do you see the Turkish people and media reacting to the United States?
Well, I mean, first of all, the narrative until recently, the government's narrative was extremely hostile to the United States, and the government, the president, and members of his cabinet have openly accused the United States of involvement in that failed coup. So anti-Americanism in Turkey is pretty strong and encouraged by the government. So I would say overall views of the US in Turkey are very, very negative. And, you know, when you say, would it help to speak up against human rights abuses and all of that? Well, it's a very fine line to walk, because on the one hand, yes, critics of the government would perhaps welcome that in a normal country, but unfortunately in Turkey, the anti-Americanism cuts across the ideological spectrum. So people who are critics of Erdogan can, by the same token, also be hugely hostile to the United States, because even before this government came to power, and even though the people who ran Turkey, the army, you know, were very closely allied with the United States, benefited hugely from, you know, aid from the United States. It's a NATO army. At the same time, had this very paranoid view of the United States, this abiding sort of conviction that somehow the United States is out to get Turkey, is out to divide Turkey, that, you know, for instance, this rebellion, this Kurdish rebellion is masterminded by the United States. It's all really goes back to the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, when this huge empire collapsed. And, you know, what they were left with was Anatolia, basically, and Istanbul. And this sense that this was all, you know, by imperial design. And so somehow that Turkey is being constantly contained, undermined by Western imperial powers. And of course, the United States being the world's #1 superpower, they would be in the lead role. And unfortunately, that Turkey has been unable to shake that off. And it's of course also encouraged by whoever is in power, because it allows those governments, and certainly the Erdogan regime, to shift responsibility to these outside troublemakers, you know, for everything that goes wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Did the Turkish media cover the summit? Did they report much on the conversation between Erdogan and Biden? There hasn't been a lot of detail, certainly in the U.S. press. So I'm just wondering about the Turkish media.
Well, in the run-up to that summit, there was a lot of speculation and a lot of optimism that was being propagated mainly by the government and its media, which is practically the whole media, because they control about 90% of the media. And of course, this was very deliberate, because the economy is in very bad shape, and the Turkish lira is constantly losing value against the dollar. And so in Erdogan's mind, if you can project better relations with the US, that sort of helps shore up investor confidence, allowing the lira to, you know, gain some value. And so this was being promoted, but, you know, the idea that somehow they would reach some kind of resolution on the S-400 issue in particular. And one of the ideas that was being floated was that these missiles would be transferred to the Incirlik air base, where the United States has a presence. It's a sovereign Turkish base, but US troops there are some troops there, which of course was never going to happen, because why would the US, you know, feel confident that Turkey wouldn't suddenly change its mind and say, hey, you know, you all have to leave. And by the way, I'm taking these S-400s back and putting them somewhere else.
Mm.
But as far as, the coverage of the summit, I mean, I think what both sides decided was to just say as little about it as possible.
Mhm.
So unusually, there's really been very little leaking from either side on what happened. But my overall impression is that, they're just trying to contain the damage, compartmentalize the relationship, and focus on areas where there can be some cooperation. And Afghanistan is one of those areas.
Mhm. Yes. Okay, and we have one question from Ambassador Cynthia Eford. Would you like
Hi.
to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, you've done such a good job of explaining the current status of media freedom, but I wonder about going forward. How vibrant is journalism as a career for younger people? How is training? And do they have a sense of the need for free, independent journalism, investigative journalism, or have they accepted that they're going to be bought and sold by these big powers, big commercial interests?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I would say that the silver lining in all of this is that because the repression is so acute, it's propelled the European Union and others to pay much more attention to the media in Turkey and to help fund independent media and to, train young journalists based on Western standards of journalism, which they never had access to that in quite the same way they do today. It's still a handful of people. There should be many more. But in the past, of course, please don't get me wrong. It's not like it was some kind of, haven for journalists and people were doing great jobs with, a great job with investigative journalism, exposing corruption, etc. No, in the old days, you had a different kind of arrangement between the military and the owners of the newspapers. There were always red lines. So, anything about the Armenian genocide or the war in the southeast against the Kurds, those were red lines that very few dared to breach. And when they did, they ended up in trouble. And throughout the 90s, at the peak of the Kurdish insurgency, when the army was waging its scorched earth campaign, many Kurdish journalists were killed or were disappeared. So, people are being jailed, but not killed, at least, fortunately. So we can take some solace from that. But yes, of course, people are hungry and they're being exposed to a new kind of real proper journalism. As I said, that's the silver lining, but it's not enough and we need much more of that. But people who are reporting, the young Turkish correspondents who are reporting for these independent outlets funded, through the EU, etc., they are talking about debating issues that never used to be debated before. And there is a definitely, given the sort of volume of corruption, the scale of it, definitely an eagerness to expose it, yes, and anything that would help fund that kind of journalism, I think would be tremendously welcome.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from another question from Michael Anderson. Can you talk about Islam in Turkey and what role does it play? And I'm also wondering about because of course in some of the neighboring countries we've seen a much more conservative Islam, and I'm just wondering because of course Turkey certainly has always been a secular state. I'm wondering how Islam is practiced in Turkey.
Well, Turkey is 99% Muslim country, Sunni Muslim country, and Sunni Muslim identity is sort of the sort of dominant identity and the one that's that's, the parameters of who is a Turk is, ethnically Turkish and Sunni Muslim, and even if you're not Sunni Muslim, that a state aims to assimilate you as they are doing with the Alevis. This is a group, a distinct confessional group that's sort of like Shia Islam, but slightly different. And those people, even though Turkey is notionally a secular state, they're not afforded the same benefits that are extended to, for example, to the Sunni Muslims. The state funds mosques, and the preachers, they're paid by the state, and these houses of worship of the Alevis, who number, we don't have an exact figure, but at least 7 to 8 million of them, the government does not accord them those benefits, for instance. What role does Islam play? We have an Islamist government in power. Erdogan is an Islamist, political Islamist, who I would say more or less is in the Muslim Brotherhood kind of category of Islamists, and increasingly does little to disguise that. And yes, there is a big effort, I would say, to whittle away the secularism and to sort of sharpen the Islamic identity. And how is that done? It's principally through the education system, where, Quranic education, religious education, all of these things have become a much more prominent in the curriculum and the types of, education materials that are used. And now you have the state religious body launching TV for kids, for instance. So, the aim is, as he says openly, is to, create new pious generations. Now, whether that's working or not is an entirely different question. And if you look at, recent field work that's been done, mosque attendance is down. People who identify themselves as pious Muslims, their numbers are decreasing. And, for the longest time, the Islamists were able to demonize the secular opposition, saying that they're enemies of Islam. And one of the big arguments that they would put forward was the fact that the headscarf, the Islamic headscarf, was banned. And that, therefore women who wore the headscarf, could not become lawyers, doctors, become diplomats. Well, these guys have been in power for 20 years now, and the ban has long since disappeared. And so that argument has been, no longer exists. So it's increasingly less convincing, though you see that Erdogan still continues the best he can to sort of use Islam to bolster his base. So what we saw, for example, with the Hagia Sophia, which for the longest time, this magnificent Byzantine church in Istanbul that Ataturk, sort of decided was best off as a museum. So, it's neither mosque, neither church, but a museum. Mm-hmm. He reconverted it to a mosque. Mm-hmm. So, yes, there is a very determined effort on the part of the government to mobilize religion and to use these symbols. They just built a huge mosque in Taksim Square, which is the main square in Istanbul, that very deliberately dwarfs this very lovely Greek Orthodox church that sits on that square as well. And then he built this ginormous mosque on a hill overlooking the Bosphorus, which again dwarfs all the other sort of more secular symbols of Istanbul, like the Genovese Tower and the churches. So it's, there's definitely, as I said, the sort of instrumentalizing of Islam, and how effective it is, especially given the fact that the economy is in such a shambles, that the corruption, is, I don't know how closely members of this audience follow Turkey, but now we have this mobster, this mafia underworld figure who's in the United Arab Emirates, who fled Turkey, who used to be very closely associated with the government and various business figures who work with the government, who's now decided to take on the government and, providing this steady drip of allegations, corruption allegations that directly implicate the government, the president, though he's sort of so far not quite gone after the president yet, but the circle is narrowing. And is much more convincing than anything the opposition would say, because he was part of them. So it's that much more credible. He was one of them, and he says so openly. So as these, they're watched by millions of people, these YouTube videos that he posts every week. So, there's this growing sort of revulsion, and you hear so many people say, people who used to be openly practicing Muslims who voted for the government because they felt that the secularists had denied them freedom of worship, who now say, they feel alienated by Islam itself because these are the people who claim to speak in its name. Mm-hmm. So, however much, looking at it from afar, it looks like Turkey is becoming some kind of Islamic republic. The truth is rather more complex than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I could ask a lot more questions. I don't know if we have any other questions from the audience. But Amberin, I just want to thank you again for just a wonderful, wonderful dialogue presentation on what's going on in Turkey today, and all of the background, how it has come to this situation. I just feel that I've gotten such a wonderful education. So it's really just absolutely fascinating, and we do share. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wonderful insights with us. So thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who attended and to your questions. We really appreciate them also. And we always try to be very respectful of people's time. So I'd like to turn the program over now to Olivia Chavez, who is going to close our program. You've gotten so many messages from Olivia, but I'm not sure you've been able to see her or hear her on the screen before. So we're very pleased that Olivia is here joining us, and she's going to tell us about the next First Monday program. So thank you again, Amberin. Thank you, Katie. And now over to you, Olivia. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta. And I just want to echo Greta's sentiments to Amberin. Super insightful, and you really holistically broke it down for us today on what's happening in Turkey, both from the past to the present to speculating about the future. So I really appreciate your time and joining us today. And just for everyone who is on the call, I do want to share that we have our First Monday Forum coming up on July 12th. It will be marking the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Peace Corps. And so we have quite an interesting panel lined up for this event that includes Dr. Jody Olson, the 20th director of the Peace Corps, Glenn Blumhorst, president and CEO of the National Peace Corps Association, Dr. Michael Anderson, who's on this call with us, who's a retired senior foreign service officer and also a former Peace Corps volunteer in Malaysia. And then lastly, we have one of our rising professionals, Blake Bergen, who's now a program specialist within ECA in the Department of State. And so they will be sharing their views on the past and future of Peace Corps in a changing world. And we look forward to having you join us next month. So stay tuned for more details and RSVP links for those future events. And with that, I think we are adjourned.
Thank you again, Olivia, and thank you, everyone. Thank you especially to Amberin. Bye for now.
Thanks.